From courtside of the virtual hardwood, it's the NLSC Podcast, a weekly show for basketball gamers and hardcore hoopheads. This is episode 571. I am Andrew in our forum, Andrew NLSC on X. I'm joined as always by my co-host Derek, DV3 in the forum, and DV3G and DV384 on X. Derek, as always, we have some fun stuff to dive into this week, so please, tip us off.
So yeah, today's topic is who is the biggest what if in basketball history? And this was a topic suggestion from NLSC Podcast listener, Louis. So thank you for that. We also received topic suggestions from Bucky T and Renee, and we will get to those on future shows. So first, Andrew, the biggest what if in basketball history. I'm going to start this one off. Andrew and I have not discussed this off air. We have not shared our choice and whatnot, so it could be the same. But I am going with Len Bias. But before I get into why it's Len Bias, I want to go over that draft. 1986, Andrew. Len Bias was taken in the first round, second pick overall, and he was taken by the Boston Celtics out of Maryland. And he spent all 4 years at Maryland and put up some numbers. We'll get into those in a second. But let's talk about this draft. At first glance, it does not look very strong. Brad Daugherty obviously ended up being an excellent player, with the Cavs. He's out of UNC. Then we had, Len Bias, who was destined to be a superstar, right? In the NBA, destined to be a player that allowed Larry Bird to possibly extend his career, possibly bringing more titles to the Celtics and whatnot. But listen to some of these other picks. So we have Chris Washburn at number 3 out of NC State. Chuck Person, who did end up being a 20-point scorer at one point in the NBA and had a long career. Kenny Skywalker, just mostly known for his dunk contest performance and just being an above the rim player, but kind of an unremarkable, right, NBA career. William Bedford, Roy Tarpley, Ron Harper at 8. Obviously, who knows what would have happened if Cleveland had hung on to him? Could they have competed better with the Bulls? That's very possible. He was part of a stacked Cleveland team, and the story about how he ended up exiting Cleveland and heading over to the Clippers is strange, to say the least. But then, it's Brad Sellers, Johnny Dawkins, John Sally, John Williams, Pearl Washington, Walter Berry, Del Curry. But it's when you go a little bit lower when you find some hidden gems here. So Scott Skiles, Andrew, was drafted out of Michigan State at number 22. And obviously he has the all-time single game assist record. He played with Shaq in Shaq's rookie year, and you can see a lot of his great dimes to Shaq in highlights. He had a very strong NBA career, amazing passer, considered one of the toughest players, right, during his time. And then at number 24 in the first round, 1986, Portland takes Arvydas Sabonis. And he doesn't end up coming over, Andrew, until 95-96. One of the biggest what ifs is Len Bias, but also in the same draft, one of the biggest what ifs is Arvydas Sabonis, right? What happens if he goes to Portland and teams up with Clyde Drexler? That would have drawn even more talent to the Trailblazers. Would they have been competing even earlier? Would they have been able to knock off the Pistons in the NBA Finals? Would Drexler have had a championship in Portland? Because by the time Arvydas Sabonis ended up coming over to the NBA in 95-96, Drexler was with Houston, right? And he was not able to get a title in his time in the NBA, even though they did compete. And then, Andrew, the pick after Arvydas Sabonis was Mark Price. So Mark Price, who was taken in the second round. And what's crazy about this is something that's not discussed enough. That he was traded by the Mavericks to the Cavaliers for a 1989 second round pick, which ended up being Jeff Hodge, who you've never heard of before, right? Or me or any of our listeners and whatnot. In fact, Jeff Hodge never played an NBA game from what I can tell. So this draft gets weirder. right? And then we get, later in the second round, a couple picks later, and then there's Dennis Rodman. He gets taken by Detroit. And obviously we know about the memorable career he had and the titles that he won out in Detroit and, for Chicago. And he ended up being a monster in the NBA. And then at 29 and 30, you got, Johnny Newman and Nate McMillan. But I find this draft fascinating because some of the best players came late. Right. So, yeah, some fascinating stuff and a lot of what ifs in this draft as well, because, what if Dallas had hung on to Mark Price? What would that have meant for that franchise as they were competing at that time? They were a powerhouse in the West. And what would that have meant for his career?
Definitely. And it does have that reputation as one of the most cursed drafts, one of the most drafts full of busts because of all the players that had substance abuse problems, or in Len Bias' case, tragically passed away before even playing in the NBA, players who washed out of the league for one reason or another. But as you said, a lot of talent the further down you go. And in the second round in particular, Jeff Hornacek as well is in a second round pick in 1986. And Arvydas Sabonis, obviously a huge what if he'd come to the NBA much earlier when he was still relatively healthy. As we've talked about before, Derek, it's been reported that when he came to the league in 1995, he actually could have qualified for disability. That's how bad his injuries were, and yet he played, and played well despite not being as mobile as he once was. But he was an incredible player, still a fantastic player later in his career with all of those injuries, but in his heyday, you can go back and look at the footage and see just how incredible he was. But to that point with Sabonis, there's another interesting what-if there. He was actually picked by the Atlanta Hawks 77th overall in 1985, the year before. The selection was voided because he was under 21 at the time of the draft. At the time, those were the rules. So he could have ended up with the Hawks as well. Another interesting what-if, obviously. And yeah, I do think Len Bias probably goes down as the biggest what-if in NBA history because of the famous comparisons with Michael Jordan, of course, such a great player in college. And it's always tough to say, Derek, because the Michael Jordan he was compared to is not the Michael Jordan that we know now. But at the same time, he was a tremendous player in college, seemed to be set up for success in the NBA. Of course, there's what-ifs there. What if substance abuse continues to be a problem for him in the league, as it was for so many other players in that 1986 draft? We don't know what would have happened. But putting that aside, talent-wise, yeah, seemed to be primed to be the next big player and the next big star that we never got. And it's not quite the same because he was only in high school, but I'll also throw out Benjamin Wilson Jr., Benji, the standout high school player from Chicago, of course, who was tragically murdered in November 1984. Teammate Nick Anderson, once described as Magic Johnson with a jump shot, one of the best high school prospects, seemed destined for future stardom, tragically gunned down like that. There was a whole ESPN 30 for 30 documentary about him. So yeah, while Len Bias was closer to superstardom and had already been a standout in college and was drafted, obviously, yeah, two big what-ifs that are quite tragic.
No, I agree. And I just want to make a couple more notes about the 1986 draft class, Andrew. So Kevin Duckworth was also taken in this draft later on by the San Antonio Spurs. But get this. So the same draft where Arvydas Sabonis was taken by the Portland Trailblazers, they also took Drazen Petrovic. So Portland took both Sabonis and Petrovic.
Wow.
Petrovic was actually taken as the 60th pick. And obviously for 86, 87, 87, 88, and 88, 89, he didn't come over to the NBA. He came over to the Trailblazers in 89, 90. So in reality, if those players had actually come over and played for the team that drafted them, Portland would have had a young 22-year-old Drazen Petrovic, a young Sabonis without the injuries, without the bad feet, etc., and Clyde Drexler, right, who was breaking out at that time. What does that mean for Portland? What does that mean for the Western Conference, right? What does that mean for the league? So that Portland situation is just a massive what if. But Len Bias, it's the timing. It's the fact that he looked to have it all. He had the physique, the wide shoulders. He was a tremendous leaper, a tremendous athlete. And, you go back and watch the highlights, and my brothers and I have talked about this a few times. His jump shot looks kind of similar to Jordan's, right? He gets up. It's his form. He has a beautiful form on his jump shot. It's uncontestable most of the time. It's unblockable, right? And he would glide to the hoop like the Grant Hills of the world and the Julius Irvings and whatnot. He just seemed to have the total package. If he ends up, donning the green and playing for the Celtics, we're talking about Larry possibly extending his career, right? Because he's not going to have as much on his shoulders. He's not going to have to play as big minutes. A lot of the weight can be taken off of him by a superstar like Len Bias, which is what everybody thought he was going to end up being. It also might have extended the careers of guys like Kevin McHale, right? And it could have kept their core together longer. And imagine if they were still able to get Reggie Lewis, right? Who knows? Possible. You never know. But the point is that you look at what he was able to do with Maryland. So he was a 1984-85 ACC Player of the Year, and then again the ACC Player of the Year in 85-86, 85-86 consensus All-American, 1984 All-ACC Tournament. He was also the MVP for the ACC Tournament that year. He broke out in his senior year. He averaged 23.2 points per game, 7 rebounds a game, and shot 54.4 from the floor. But you go back and watch that tape. Look at what type of physical specimen he was. Look at his ability to score the ball and the way he could impact the game on both ends. I can't see any other way his NBA career would go. I just think he would be an absolute monster. I think he would have been a superstar. And you never know. Maybe Larry would have a 4th or 5th championship as well.
Kind of makes me want to put together this what-if situation. Len Bias on the Celtics versus the Blazers with young Petrovic, young Sabonis. That would be an absolutely stacked video game team, would it not? Those Blazers, as it is, they're already a pretty strong team. But to add those players, young, healthy, absolutely incredible. I want to throw another what-if out there, Derek, and I talked about this last month in Way Back Wednesday, but what if Karl Malone broke the all-time scoring record? Because he was close. He was coming close, and it looked like he was going to be the one to do it, of all the players. And I say of all the players, that is downplaying his abilities to some extent, but you think, it's going to be a Julius Irving, a Moses Malone, Michael Jordan, obviously, if he had played long enough. And if Michael Jordan had played enough games, I think he would have easily eclipsed that record and put up numbers similar to what LeBron James has amassed at this point. But if Karl Malone had broken the scoring record in the early to mid-2000s, which could have done, and again, I went into how he could have numerically in that What If article, Derek, I think that really changes the perspective of that record, because Malone, as great as he was, as a player, as a person, whole other topic, of course, but as great as he was not the face of the league. He was not ever in that top 10, or certainly greatest of all time, discussion during his career. Top 10 in the league in his prime, but not top 10 all time.
Top 10 in the league in his prime constantly. And the other piece of that, too, is imagine Karl Malone presenting that game ball to LeBron James in front of a packed stadium. You wouldn't have heard cheers.
No.
You would have heard boos. Because all of the personal stuff with Karl Malone came to light, mostly after he retired, right? And especially since the height of social media, right? And the stuff that he's accused of and this kind of the stuff that he's admitted to, it really tells you that he was probably a complete scumbag.
Oh, yeah.
As a human being, right? So you wouldn't have heard cheers, you would have heard boos, and rightly so. And anytime Karl Malone gets brought up today, anytime he's doing an interview, anytime that's highlighted by the NBA channel, anytime he gets brought up, he is just absolutely destroyed in the comment sections.
Yeah, and rightfully so, yeah.
And rightfully so. So I don't think it would have been a good look for the NBA. I think it would have been bad because they would have had to constantly be bringing up he's chasing Karl Malone, right? He's not chasing Kareem, he's chasing Karl Malone, and then everybody brings the personal stuff up again. So I'm glad it didn't happen.
Yeah. To
be honest with you, because Kareem is a much more likable guy, and he doesn't have that tainted past like Karl Malone does. So, but yeah, it would have been interesting if he had actually done it.
And even putting aside the personal reasons, which we really shouldn't, I mean, those are some horrible things, obviously, but from a purely basketball standpoint, if that record is broken by somebody who was never in the GOAT debate, then what's the perception of it as an accomplishment? That's something I brought up in my article. And that's not to denigrate Malone as a basketball player. That's not to denigrate Kareem, obviously, or LeBron. But again, even putting aside the personal stuff, the off-court stuff, and simply focusing on basketball, LeBron James breaks Kareem's record sounds much more impressive than LeBron breaks Karl Malone's record.
Agreed. I'll say this about Karl Malone. I watch a lot of footage. I watch YouTube games all the time, right? Like the classic footage from the 90s, from the 80s, the early 2000s. Karl Malone, he is one of the best mid-range shooters from the power forward position of all time. I watch these games, and so many of his points, sometimes 20 to 30 points he scores in a game, come from mid-range pull-ups. You watch young Malone in like the mid and late 80s, and he's not doing that as much. He's more attacking the rim. He's being more physical inside and whatnot. But he really developed that mid-range shot. And I think that's a super underrated skill. And actually, the purpose of me bringing that up is more to say, like, I wish more big guys, more power forwards and centers did that today, because I think the likes of Hakeem Olajuwon, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki, Karl Malone, Charles Barkley developed it, right? Amare Stoudemire was doing that in the mid-range as well for quite some time. Sean Kemp developed it. Remember how often he would shoot that mid-range shot in his later Seattle days and when he went to Cleveland and whatnot. I just think that is a super underrated skill. I think it allows you to operate better in the mid-range. I think it allows you to operate better in the high post, making it so you have to be respected out there, so it brings the defense out and then you can make a move towards the hoop. I just think it causes a lot more attention to you as a player. Such a nifty skill. And I'm not trying to throw compliments at Karl Malone, but you can't deny the facts. He was an amazing mid-range shooter.
Oh, credit where it's due.
For the second half of his career.
Absolutely. And it's always tough to compliment someone when they have personal issues like that. But strictly speaking about basketball, he was a tremendous player, just not in the GOAT debate, which is why I think that would really have affected the perception of that record. Not to say it wouldn't have been an accomplishment still, but it certainly has a better ring when you break Kareem's record as opposed to, that's Karl Malone's record. When it's not somebody who's in that top 10 all-time debate and that GOAT debate, as Kareem has been throughout the years, certainly would have changed the perception. Another what if, obviously, is if Michael Jordan ever retires the first time. I'm going to be talking more about that in a Way Back Wednesday next week, actually. I do think he would have gotten much closer to the all-time record, or indeed broken the scoring record, Derek. I will say, though, I'm not sure that they actually get 8 straight titles. I think they could have fallen to the Rockets. I'm not going to be a Jordan fanboy here, as much as I'm a Jordan fan, Derek. I'm not going to be a myopic fanboy, and say that they would definitely win 8 in a row. Possibly he has 1 or 2 more if he plays all the way through. But what if they do run into the Rockets like that? What if they do drop a title? What moves do they make or not make? Do they take Michael Finley, 20th overall, instead of Jason Caffey in 1995? Reload for the next generation. Couple of what-ifs there.
Well, one of my what-ifs has to do with Rockets-Bulls, but it doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with the 1997 loss, where the Rockets lost to the Jazz and then ended up being Jazz-Bulls in the finals as opposed to Rockets-Bulls. I honestly am not 100% sure the Bulls win that title if the Rockets make it, if they have the legs in the finals, because I don't think that Jazz team was as complete as the Rockets. I don't think that they matched up as well with the Bulls. I think that if, you get into the finals and now instead of facing Greg Ostertag and Brian Russell and Jeff Hornacek, right, and whatnot, you're now facing Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler, right? And then, sure, you're against Karl Malone when you play the Jazz in the finals, but now you're also against Charles Barkley if you play the Rockets. So I think that the Rockets actually had a more complete team and a team that could better compete with the Bulls. And I really do question if the Bulls win the NBA Finals if they have to play the Rockets in 1997. So my what if there would be if the Rockets get past the Jazz. I also want to point out that another one of my what ifs has to do with Michael Jordan. So if the Trailblazers actually take Michael Jordan, it's still possible that they get Petrovic and Sabonis in 86, right? Who knows? Because they were late. They were taken late. So Sabonis was taken 24th. Petrovic was taken 60th. So what ends up happening if they get Jordan and Drexler and they still have picks where they can get Sabonis and Petrovic later? Do you think that if Jordan's with the Trailblazers and they're winning a bunch of games, that maybe Petrovic and Sabonis come over earlier? Right? So it's really interesting, the whole Blazers situation. And it's funny because Michael Jordan falls into it. He falls into the what if there. Another one that I wanted to bring up too was Dino Radja comes over to play with the Celtics in 1989 at age 22, as opposed to in 1993 at age 26. So there's a difference there. You know, if you take a look at Dino Radja, even when he played against the Dream Team in 1992 alongside Tony Kukoc, Dino Radja he was thinner. He was more athletic. He looked much faster up and down the court. I showed one of his dunks actually on Twitter, and his head is near the rim. He just skied for it in the game against the Dream Team. And he was like a one-man fast break out there. You know, what happens if Dino Radja, young, athletic, explosive Dino Radja, comes over in 1989 to help the aging Celtics? Right? So, you know, Bias passed and whatnot. It's the 1989 Celtics that we know. Who knows? Like, he could definitely help them out. There was conversation about the 90-91 Celtics being a legitimate title contender. They had a chance that year. Now insert Dino Radja in there and what happens. So I think Dino Radja is a what if, and I think people don't understand how good of a player he really was, especially the younger crowd today.
And I think one of the big things back then was the perception of foreign players, that they were projects, that they had to take a back seat, that they weren't necessarily willing to come over. Language barriers, obviously, cultural barriers, and certainly political situations with the Soviet Union back in the day probably contributed to Sabonis staying in Europe for as long as he did. Just want to flash back to the prospect of the Rockets and Bulls in 1997. I agree. I mean, I would, in my heart, I suppose, still pick the Bulls, but it's not a given. You look back at the two meetings they had during the 1997 season, within the span of 8 days. First game, January 11th, 1997, in Chicago, the Bulls win 110-86. And you say, oh, well, look at that. They could easily contend with that Rockets team. 8 days later, January 19th, in Houston, the Rockets win 102-86. So that could have been a very interesting finals. And regular season records and head-to-head matchups don't always mean anything. The Bulls lost both of their games to the Jazz in 1998, for example, during the regular season, and still prevailed in the finals. So it's not necessarily an indication of anything at the best of times, but those games don't really tell us anything. Two blowouts could have gone either way, but yeah, that definitely would have been a challenge for the Bulls in 1997. And yeah, Dino Radja, Tony Kukoc coming over to the Bulls a bit earlier as well. Don't think he would have necessarily been welcomed by Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, the way they went at him in the 92 Olympics, of course. But yeah, a lot of players who, if they'd come to the NBA earlier, I've said it before, Derek, I think a couple of Aussies like Andrew Gaze, Shane Heal, if they'd come in at a different time when the NBA was more open to foreign-born players coming in and giving them more of a run. Look at the way Shane Heal used to knock down threes. I've shared that footage on X as well when he went off in the fourth quarter of that game. Him in the modern NBA. Back in 1994, here in Australia in the NBL, Shane Heal made 12 threes in 1994 and 2001 as well. In fact, there's quite a few players with double-digit three-pointers long before it was happening in the NBA. So you get those players who were known for their outside shooting into the league at a time when that was more welcome, at a time when the league was more open to foreign-born players getting more of a run, as they have become in the past couple of decades. Yeah, a lot of international players could have had stronger NBA careers.
Agreed. I also want to point out that you brought up those two matchups in 1997 between the Rockets and the Bulls. Just an interesting note. So when the Bulls blew out the Rockets in that first meeting, 110-86, the Rockets had a full team. It was Barkley, Olajuwon, Drexler, Mario Elie, and Matt Maloney. And Kevin Willis was healthy and played. They had their whole team. In that game, Barkley played incredibly poor. 2 for 11 from the floor, and Jordan had 32 points, 6 rebounds, and 7 assists. But you go to the blowout win the Rockets had just a week and a half later, and Barkley was out. So it was Hakeem, Drexler, and Kevin Willis was starting in Barkley's place. So, in those two matchups, that's a very small sample size, but they actually played better without Barkley when they got that win. Who knows what would have happened there? So, Andrew, before we get to the community responses, did you have any other what ifs you wanted to bring up?
Well, speaking of Barkley, the big what if there, what if you've been traded to the Lakers for James Worthy? How does James Worthy's career possibly peter out in Philadelphia? Does Charles Barkley win a championship with the Lakers? Does he play multiple years for the Lakers? Does he go on to play for the Rockets in the late 90s? And Chuck talked about that recently and talked about how he'd gone out drinking to celebrate and then found out that the trade had been cancelled, so he has to play a game, and said he doesn't remember much from that game at all. But that's a huge what if. We talk about the trades that might have happened. The Clippers apparently once offered the Bulls any 5 players of their choice plus draft picks for Michael Jordan when they weren't sure that Michael Jordan would ever win a title in Chicago and whether he'd stick around with the Bulls. So that's a huge what if as well. The trades that could have happened. So yeah, for Charles Barkley, the possibility of going to the Lakers, a huge what if.
What happens if Magic Johnson spends the summer of 1996 getting in shape and comes back to play for another year or two and plays with Shaq and Kobe?
Huge.
That's another one. That'd be great for video games, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there'd be some great video game teams there. But, he comes back and he's able to mentor, and, he's still able to play at a decent level like he was in the 95-96 season. My God, that would have been super interesting.
And of course, we talked about drafts and trades and what might have been there, but you look at one of the most controversial series in NBA history, the 2002 Western Conference Finals. What if the Kings make their free throws in Game 6, Game 7? They did still have a chance to win that, despite all the controversy. And you go back and read the oral history of that series. A lot of Kings players, like Chris Webber, I think Bobby Jackson might have said it as well, that if they'd made their free throws, they still could have won Game 7. If they go on to the finals, they interrupt the Lakers three-peat. That really changes the course of history.
Yeah, there are two teams from the 2000s, so 2000 to 2010, that from that time frame, that I think are NBA championship caliber teams, and it is a damn shame that they didn't win one. And it's those early 2000s Kings teams, so 01, 02 specifically, and then the Nash, Amari Stoudemire, Sean Marion sons.
Yeah.
I just you watch those teams and how they were, the way they played, the talent that they had, the ways they could attack on offense, the surprisingly good defense at times, even from a Mike D'Antoni led team where they could really lock down. I find that those two teams, it's a damn shame that they didn't win an NBA championship, because I think those were NBA championship caliber rosters.
Before we go on, a reminder that the NLSC podcast comes out every week on the NLSC, NBA-live.com, as well as our YouTube channel. We're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast apps. If you're listening on any of those apps, we'd greatly appreciate a review. To keep up with the show and everything we're doing with basketball gaming in general, connect with us on social media. On Twitter and Facebook, we are the NLSC. We also have an Instagram, NLSC Basketball, and on YouTube, we're youtube.com/NBA Live Series Center. Once again, visit us at NBA-live.com, where in addition to the podcast, you'll also find all of our original content, as well as our forum and modding community.
So, Andrew, let's get to the community responses. The Cyber Athlete Gaming states Jordan and the Bulls versus Akeem and the Rockets in the 94 finals. So he's not choosing the Drexler Rockets. He's choosing pre-Drexler 1994 Rockets team. So had Mike not decided to chase the curveball out of the strike zone for a year, the Bulls would have made it back to the finals. Yeah, it would have been interesting. Right. Even without Drexler, that Rockets team actually finished with a better record in the regular season, and they were even stronger inside that year with Otis Thorpe and whatnot. And they just crowded Hakeem with shooters. What a great formula, right? Because you have to double Hakeem Olajuwon. He draws so much attention. And, you've got Kenny Smith out there, and you've got Sam Cassell off the bench, and, you've got Mario Ellie, et cetera. And Robert Ory, who stepped out and hit him. And I just think that they had the perfect formula to be a contending team. And they won 2 titles in a row, even after the Drexler acquisition.
Yeah, and like I said, maybe the Bulls get back to the finals with MJ there, and possibly they get 4 straight. I'm not going to rule it out. As I say in my upcoming Way Back Wednesday, it's certainly possible. But yeah, I can't rule out the possibility that the Rockets wouldn't have their number, especially with Hakeem, obviously. And the Rockets did match up well with them, and I think have a winning record against them in the 80s and 90s with MJ and the Dream going head-to-head. So yeah, I can't rule out the Bulls not getting the 4 straight. Do they meet again in 1995, and maybe the Bulls get revenge, or maybe they lose 2 in a row? Who knows, especially if Horace Grant does leave for the Magic still. And do they get Dennis Rodman the next year to make another run and either take out the Rockets or the Supersonics as they ultimately did? So yeah, very interesting what-ifs there, and it's very easy for me as a Bulls fan to say, oh, they would have had 8 straight if he never retired, and again, won't completely rule it out, but I don't think it's a given.
And I think it was Jordan himself that stated they were worried about Hakeem Olajuwon. And I believe Phil Jackson mentioned it too. They just didn't have an answer for him, right? Like Hakeem Olajuwon would have probably have been the Bulls' worst nightmare. So they might get one of those championships off the Bulls. They might get 2, the same ones they got. So who knows? Stasho Bro at Nate Stasho states, Jay Williams or Drazen Petrovic. And we already know about the greatness of Drazen Petrovic. What a legend, right? Amazing shooter. We already know about, the success he had in his short NBA career, especially with the New Jersey Nets. And he's also one of the biggest what ifs because he didn't come over when he was originally drafted. But Andrew, I was revisiting Jay Williams to get his signature shots for the 02-03 roster that I was working on NBA 2K25. So I'm watching some, full game footage and highlights of him on YouTube. And my God, was he quick. And he could really dribble the ball. And who knows how good he would have been as an NBA player. I think he averaged close to 9-10 points a game in the one season he played before his motorcycle accident. And he is definitely a what if for that struggling Bulls franchise because they were not in good shape overall at the time, and they needed that young talent. And his performance on the basketball court for sure is better than what his voice has been in the media and on NBA Live 19.
Oh, for sure. And he was seemingly coming into his own towards the end of that year. Came off the bench earlier in the season, got the starting nod, started to show what he could do. Like you say, very quick, great handles, was starting to get the hang of the NBA. Then that motorcycle accident just ended his career, basically. Did attempt to come back with the Nets, I believe, a couple of years later, fizzled out during the preseason. I believe he was on that squad or training camp. Added him to the roster. I remember adding him to an NBA Live current roster update when I was doing the NLSC updates back in the day because it looked like he might be able to make a comeback, but that is a big injury to come back from, to say the least. And yeah, absolutely a what if, and the Bulls eventually got other stars and other good players, and look, I enjoyed the Bulls' rise in the mid-2000s, and the Derrick Rose years were special, but yeah, you do think what if when it comes to Jay Williams.
Gilbert's Grape at Sheepsman states Penny, Grant Hill. Those are 2 obvious ones, and those are commonly brought up today. Bill Walton and Len Bias. And Bill Walton that situation is fascinating because the injuries hit him early on, and the fact that Portland Trailblazers team took out the darlings, the 76ers, who everybody was picking to win at the time, with Julius Erving and Daryl Dawkins and Henry Bibby and George McGinnis and that stacked squad. And here comes Bill Walton and the Trailblazers just absolutely ruining it for them and winning that 1977 NBA championship. Yeah, who knows what would have happened. I'll certainly tell you that he won't end up going to the Clippers, right? Yeah. He would probably have stayed with the Trailblazers and had a long, healthy, successful career with them. And then, you know what? You never know. If the injuries hadn't hit, maybe we wouldn't have gotten him in Boston in 85-86 and had him for that 86 title. So, a lot of what ifs there. And then he also mentioned Drazen Petrovic. He states he was already starting to blossom into a star before his tragic passing. His career could have been so much more had he not died as early as he did. So we definitely agree with him there.
And Bill Walton was a tremendous player as it stands, but he was fantastic in college, could have been even better at the NBA level, longer career, healthier career, like you say, probably wouldn't have let the Blazers, because from memory he did fall out with them because he felt that they mismanaged his injury, so that was a big part of the split. The demand of the trade that sent him to the Clippers, and like you say, then he ends up in Boston, who knows? And that is the fascinating thing about these what-ifs, obviously, is that, for want of a nail, it's not just the one thing that changes. There's that ripple effect, that butterfly effect, the domino effect throughout history. I've talked about making what-if rosters before for video games, and it's a great idea, and you can put together some single-game scenarios, just two-team scenarios, but if you're trying to make a whole season, a whole what-if roster, trying to comprehend all the ripple effects, all the subsequent what-ifs that would happen, and the possibilities when you change one thing in history, yeah, it's just fascinating. And of course, Grant Hill, Penny Hardaway, like you say, very common answers, two of the biggest what-ifs from the 90s. Grant Hill still had a pretty long and successful career when it's all said and done, and Penny did have a couple of pretty good years afterwards when he was healthy, but yeah, those were supposed to be the guys for the next generation, for the 2000s.
And the thing with Grant Hill, too, is I've always said that we might have seen his peak as far as his skill level and production. His 99-2000 season, he was age 27. And he was healthy, right? He played 74 games. He averaged 25.8 points, 6.6 rebounds, and 5.2 assists. So we may have seen the best version of Grant Hill, as far as his skills and athleticism combined on the court. But who knows what he would have been able to do from an accolade standpoint, right? Awards, championships,
on a better team.
What would have happened in his career. Right, exactly. So it's interesting with these guys because we may have seen the best version of Grant Hill. We saw the best version of Tracy McGrady. Penny, I don't know. He might have had a little bit more room there to grow, and we may not have seen the best version of him. But yeah, these what ifs are wild. And Derrick Rose, you know what? He was so young when he got hurt. We may not have seen the best version of Derrick Rose, regardless of that MVP. So who knows what type of numbers he would have been putting up. And I think that that's why Derrick Rose gets brought up most often, because he won that MVP and he was so young and he still had so much room to grow. And then boom, his whole career got turned sideways. So yeah, just wild stuff there. At King J. Mace states, Ed Booger Smith, one of the coldest NYC point guards, but he fell into street life before he could make the league. I've talked with my brothers about this before. We've actually had this conversation numerous times, my brothers and, a couple of my best friends. Is the best talent always in the NBA? Are the best players always in the NBA? Because there's a lot of great players that never made it. Right? A lot of great players who fell into the wrong lifestyle, but as far as skills on the basketball court, as far as the things that they could do in between the lines, their athleticism, all of that stuff. I think there's a lot of people that didn't make it that would have been excellent players. Right. And that's because they fell into that life. And so I love that he always keeps an eye on the street ball scene. He's always looking at past and present street ballers and evaluating them and stuff like that. But yeah, we've had those discussions before.
Yeah. And once again, reminds me of Ben Wilson. And, that was obviously a very tragic example of it. But what he could have been if he had gone to college, as he would have done, and got to the NBA. Obviously, with what-ifs, nothing is guaranteed. Lots of things could have happened. Injuries could have gone down a bad path, whatever. But still, we're left to wonder what if because of that tragic circumstance. And you look at street ballers who grew up playing against Kareem and Dr. J, and supposedly, when they worked out with teams and scrimmaged with teams, really dominating against these superstars, the greats of the game. So you wonder what would happen if they'd made the NBA. Of course, you hear some of them say things like, "Oh, if I had a jump shot, they wouldn't be talking about Dr. J. They wouldn't be talking about MJ." Well, why didn't you have a jump shot? We talk about what ifs. Well, that was a situation that you could control. They could have potentially developed those skills. But in all fairness, there is still that what if there, that if they had that opportunity and made it to the NBA, what could have been?
Knowledge Bone at the Harassment states, outside of Len, Penny, and Hill staying injury-free, but one of my personal ones, Steph and KG, workout and mini. And what a combination that would have been, right? As if they had been able to, if Steph hadn't had his disagreements with management, if he hadn't had the falling out with Minnesota, and him and KG were allowed to grow a little bit more together. That Minnesota team could have been special. Steven at the Live King states, Jonathan Bender in Indiana. He was like KD before KD. And Bender, 6'11", 202, so tall, slender, still had those wide shoulders and whatnot. We mostly know him for appearing in the slam dunk contest and some nice in-game jams. But yeah, he looked like he could have been a complete player. But I was reading up on this because Steven mentioned it, and he was just plagued with injuries, including, from what I can tell, a bad right knee for the duration of his NBA career, and he was never able to overcome that.
Yeah, Jonathan Bender, the player that people would get in every Live 2001 franchise. I remember back in the day, the player to get because he had such a great potential attribute and was athletic and tall and had some pretty decent ratings at the time because he seemed to be shaping up as a pretty good player. So, yeah, he was kind of the favorite of franchise gamers in the early 2000s, and understandably so. But, yeah, when you have a knee injury or any kind of serious injury that early in your career, not good news.
In a similar way, Josh Smith was a pretty heavy favorite for drafts in the late 2000s because of that size, that upside, that jumping ability, the dunking ability, the versatility, stuff like that. So, Mike P for 3 at Mike Purchard states Grant Hill, Penny Hardaway, Brandon Roy, Greg Oden. Greg Oden's one that we don't talk about a lot, obviously taken ahead of Kevin Durant in the draft. Portland has just had a lot of bad luck and has made a lot of bad decisions over the last 30 to 40 years. He states Sam Bowie, Yao Ming, and Jay Williams in no particular order. And I was always super impressed with Sam Bowie. Obviously, he shouldn't have gone where he went in the draft, but before his injuries to both his legs, actually, he was a hell of a shot blocker. Long and lean, you could finish around the rim, could hit that little mid-range elbow shot, etc. But versatile big guy. It's too bad he got hit with injuries the way he did. He also states, what if any one of these players didn't get injured and have to cut their career short? For me, I always think about what if with Grant Hill. As for me, he was next. So, next up to be the face of the NBA. Neon and Butch Gaming states, I'm late, zero questioning. It's Len Bias and Lewis combo, so Reggie Lewis. Celtics win in 87. McHale recovers his broken foot. They repeat in 88. Bird surgery in 89 still gives Lewis his opportunity to shine. Celtics again in 90. And then he states they'd still trade Ainge in 89, win one or two more if Lewis is alive too. Yeah, I still think they probably trade Ainge, and Dennis Johnson was long in the tooth at that point. I don't think he's going to be extending his career due to Len Bias being on the squad. I think he was pretty much done when he retired. But yeah, like I said, Reggie Lewis was taken late in the first round by the Celtics in 1987. Even if Len Bias plays with them and they win the title in 87, they still can probably get Lewis because it's a late first round pick. They had made the finals that year anyway. And yeah, who knows what would have happened as far as, allowing people like McHale to recover, allowing people like Bird to extend his career and not have to worry about rushing back, and just what would have happened with that combo of Len Bias and Lewis and McHale and Bird, et cetera. So interesting stuff. Super at Soup Knows Ball. My biggest what if is if the Chris Paul trade to the Lakers hadn't been rescinded. And does it move the needle? Because I'm not saying that Steve Nash was Chris Paul, right, at the time, but they couldn't win with what was considered a championship lineup when Steve Nash went there. So it was, if you remember correctly, it was Steve Nash, Kobe Bryant, Meta World Peace, Pau Gasol, and Dwight Howard. Remember, it was just all over the news about that team, and you saw the graphics about how dominant they were going to be and all of that stuff, and then it just didn't work out. Does Chris Paul move the needle to allow Kobe to get a couple more rings or even one more ring? What do you think?
I mean, anything's possible in that lockout season, I suppose, and obviously he raised the profile of the Clippers, allowed them to become a winning team for the first time in a long time, but I don't think it's guaranteed. Does he necessarily make a good combination with Kobe Bryant. And they've got other players aging, other players injured. So yeah, I don't think it necessarily works out as well as everybody thinks. It's funny that people cite this, and I say people, I mean Lakers fans, cite this as the league having a thing against the Lakers. The idea that the league has a bias against the Lakers is absolutely ridiculous. We'll just put it out there. But yeah, obviously a complicated situation. Would have been very interesting to see, obviously. But yeah, I don't think it necessarily brings a title.
You got to remember, too, that if they get Chris Paul, obviously they're not going to get Nash in 12-13 if they have a, prime Chris Paul.
They don't have Gasol and Odom either. They're in the deal.
Right, exactly. They don't have Gasol and Odom. And if he comes over, does he really push the Lakers, and with those other moving parts, does he really push the Lakers past that awesome Thunder team? Because if you remember correctly, in the 2012 playoffs, the Thunder beat the Lakers 4-1 in that series. So I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think they were giving up a lot, and I'm not sure they pushed past the Thunder. I'm not sure if it gets Kobe another ring. I'm not sure if it gets Chris Paul his only ring, etc. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting what if. Live in Case states Len is certainly one of them, so Len Bias. Justin Francis says, to mix things up a bit, how about Brazilian scoring legend Oscar Schmidt? Drafted in the 6th round in 1984. He never played an NBA game, yet went on to score nearly 50K points in his pro/Olympic career. Averaged 41 points per game in 5 games at the 88 Olympics and dropped 55 on Spain. Yeah, if you watch that footage of Oscar Schmidt, he had the NBA body. He had the NBA strength. And back then, the game was super physical at that time. He was a professional scorer by all means and just could get a shot off from anywhere. Go on YouTube and watch that footage. Yeah, I mean, why not? Right? Like, what happens if he does come over to the NBA? Does he change the landscape a bit? But he definitely looked like a player that had all the tools to be a great NBA player.
Another player coming along in an age where international players didn't necessarily get the same respect, the same regard. They didn't get the opportunities in the NBA. It took a few players like Petrovic, like Dirk later on, and even Dirk was kind of riding the bench early on in his career as well. So they didn't always get the opportunities, international players, unless they came through the college system, of course, and proved themselves in the States. So, yeah, I think that's a great what-if, and I think he would have been successful, certainly had the physique, as you said, and the skills. So, yeah, that's a great one.
And just a reminder, too, that in 93-94, he averaged 33.2 points and 5 rebounds a game on 46.4 shooting and 42% from 3 on 11.2 three-point attempts a game, Andrew, for Liga ACB. So even coming up into the mid-90s, he seemed more than capable and was putting up incredible numbers. To his point, in the Olympics in 1988, 42.7 points, 8.3 rebounds, and 50% from 3 on 7.1 attempts per game. Again, that's 1988. And then in 1992, obviously, as you know, Barcelona, it's where the Dream Team competed and won gold. He averaged 28 points per game in 5 games. So, yeah, I mean, 30.2 points per game in 5 games in 1996 in Atlanta and those Olympics. So even going, into the late 90s, he was putting up numbers. So just completely wild stuff. And size-wise, Andrew, listed at 6'9", 240. So incredible size as well. So Royce, at Royce Brink 14, we could dedicate a show to his responses, Andrew, because he gets so into it, and I love the fact that he interacts with the show. We're not going to be able to read out all of these responses today, but I can read a couple of them. So he states 1984 and 1996 draft being done with what we know now. Does his airness go 1 or 2? Same with Olajuwon, Barkley, Stockton. They got to go higher, I feel. AI, Kobe, Nash, Allen, do they go 1 through 4 in 96? What if Marbury and Allen don't get traded for each other? Same with Kobe. He states Shaq and Penny if Shaq doesn't leave Orlando in addition to having a healthy Penny. Magic don't blow 20-point lead in game 1 of 95 finals. Do they win a title? And lastly, Cleveland from 1989 through 1994. What if they go on a run and go to the finals and win? Mark Price, Craig Elo, Brad Daugherty, Larry Nance, Hot Rod Williams, Gerald Wilkins would all get rings. So Yeah, he also brings up a couple other pieces like, Carmelo Anthony's career trajectory. What if him and AI play longer together? What if Linsanity is extended, etc. But yeah, thanks for getting into the show and providing all of your what ifs. But yeah, some good choices there.
And he also mentions the Ray Allen 3 in the 2013 finals. Yeah, if that play doesn't happen, if Kawhi Leonard makes those free throws, if the rebound is secured by the Spurs, yeah, that really changes the trajectory of certainly the Heat's run and possibly LeBron's career.
Moving over to Discord, Pep states easy, Len Bias. Vin states Hornets not trading Kobe. And yeah, I mean, I don't think Kobe wanted to play for the Hornets. I think that was well known. I'm not sure he would have reported to the Hornets. And it was pretty much a done deal that he was going to be with the Lakers when the Hornets drafted him. So I don't think either way you would have seen Kobe donning a Hornets uniform.
The one thing that might have interrupted that was Vlade Divac not wanting to report to the Hornets. He was threatening to retire rather than comply with the trade, so maybe they would have had to have come up with something else to make that happen. But they were moving players to get Shaq to sign, or to be able to sign Shaq, I should say, and that was something they were trying to do. The Hornets selected Kobe on behalf of the Lakers, so they were going to make that trade. That's kind of been a bit of a revisionist history, I feel, with Kobe, where they say, oh, the Nets could have had him, or the Hornets could have had him. But yeah, definitely from his camp, there were reports that he wanted to go to the Lakers, or certainly not those teams, and the Lakers were making that play and making those deals to bring him in. So, interesting what if, but I think he was always going to be a Laker.
Lastly, on Discord, QB1120 states Grant Hill and his botched ankle surgeries, Tim Duncan joining him and T-Mac in Orlando, and Chris Paul Lakers trade. So, Andrew, do we get any responses on Facebook?
We did indeed, and there's a rather interesting one to start off with. So first up we have Chad, says Sam Clancy. May remember him being picked in 2002, never played in the NBA, actually was playing until 2020. I looked this up. He played overseas from the early 2000s right through to 2020. Very successful career in Europe. But yeah, I guess not one of those players that we really talk about. But I do remember him from being in NBA Live and probably the other games at the time, if I go back and look through the rosters, that he's there, appeared in more NBA video games than NBA games. John says, what if Yao Ming played a full career without injuries? And if Chris Paul traded the Lakers was not vetoed in 2011, this would also mean that Powell will be traded to the Rockets then. And that is the thing, as we said, you need to take into account that Powell was going to be traded, Lamar Odom was going to be traded, so it wasn't like they were adding Chris Paul to a team that would have Kobe and Powell and Odom and be at the same...
People talk about it, yeah, when people talk about it, sorry for interrupting, but yeah, people when they talk about it, they act like it's just going to be they get Chris Paul.
Chris Paul for
like
nothing.
They're not talking about the move, right? They're not talking about the moving pieces, and that's why I even bring up things like if the Celtics get Lewis in '87, right? It's possible they still take him, but also remember that Lewis plays a similar position to Len Bias, right? Like it's very possible that they don't get Lewis. Maybe they go for a different position. You can't guarantee that the Celtics take Lewis in 1987 after a championship season, or in a full season with Len Bias, right? So like there's a lot, these what if scenarios get clouded in kind of things that are not guaranteed or even sometimes impossible to happen.
And yeah, do you still have the draft pick that they ended up using to get certain players if certain things happen? Absolutely. This is, again, the ripple effects that we talked about. And Yao Ming, had a pretty successful career, obviously, but probably could have gone longer if he was healthier. I think he would have, and possibly been part of a more successful team. Maybe he gets traded or signs with a different team and wins a championship somewhere. Next up, we have Sixth Man of the Year, says, what if Kobe was never traded on draft night? As we said, probably was always going to happen, but certainly there's a huge what if he did somehow end up on another team. And also says, what if Ray Allen was never traded on that same draft night, giving us the combination of KG and Allen. And of course, KG and Ray Allen did play together later for your Celtics to great success in the 2008 season. But yeah, maybe they would have been a better duo early on. Marbury, as we said, clashed with management, and that didn't last very long.
I find the Kobe to Charlotte thing funny for another reason, because who was the face of the Charlotte Hornets at that time when Kobe was being drafted? So think about that 96, 97 Charlotte Hornets roster. Glenn Rice was their guy. And Kobe ends up playing with him. 99-2000, Rice is with the Lakers, and that's when the Lakers get that first title with Kobe and Shaq.
That's true.
So I do find that interesting. So sure, he didn't play with Rice and Charlotte, but he got him a few years later, and they won a title.
And finally, Jared says, I still wonder if the Bobcats brand name would have truly endeared itself to Charlotte had they won the AD sweepstakes, or even just drafted Dame or Beal instead of who they actually drafted. Maybe they would have rebranded to the Hornets anyway, but it's possible the Bobcats will still be the Bobcats had they had that marquee superstar in their colours. And I suppose if the Bobcats had been a bit more successful, then maybe the name sticks, perhaps. But I think as soon as the Hornets moniker became available once again, Derek, they were going to grab that once again. Such a better name. The history, you can swap the history with New Orleans, get the original Hornets history back, get that nostalgia there, and get that new version of the Hornets branding. As long as that opportunity presented itself, I think they would have gone back to being the Hornets regardless.
Well, did you ever need a Bobcats fix? I need it from time to time. I got to be honest with you. The uniforms, the players that played for them when they were the Bobcats, looking back on footage of the legend Adam Morrison, shot blocking phenom Emeka Okafor.
There's some nostalgia there. I agree.
There's some nostalgia there. Gerald Wallace as their key guy at one point, Jason Richardson's stint, all of that stuff. Just, I don't know. There's still something, there's a lore to the Bobcats. They know their floors, their jerseys, the players that played for them. Never said they were good. I don't want that on my record, saying that they were a good team. But, some memorable stuff there.
I mean, we could do a whole show about what constitutes a good and bad name for a basketball team. I mean, Lakers is a name that works because it's been around for so long and, of course, applied to Minneapolis when they were there originally, not so much Los Angeles, but they've been successful and the name has become synonymous with that success, so we just kind of accept it. It's been there for decades. Bobcats, a bobcat is a thing, a large cat. So,
I've said before, I didn't like the Raptors and Grizzlies at first.
Sure.
Like I thought those names were silly. Yeah, and then they grew on me, right? And I think it was the same thing with the Bobcats. It kind of grew on me.
So thank you to everybody who shared their what-ifs, and to Louis for suggesting the topic. Yeah, such a fascinating topic, Derek. Once again, you look at the butterfly effects, the ripple effects, how this would have changed that, for want of a nail, and all of that stuff. Yeah, what-ifs will always be fun to dive into.
Super fascinating stuff, and I just think there's so many moving parts to each one of these what-ifs. So there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees certain players would have played with each other. There's no guarantees of success or anything like that. Basically, we can just dream up what may have happened. So yeah, it's definitely a cool conversation. And thank you to all of the NLSC community for participating in the mailbag questions each week. We just were flooded with responses to this one on our various platforms. So we appreciate you.
And once again, thank you to the other topic suggestions. We look forward to getting to them in the coming weeks on the NLSC podcast. With that being said, that has brought us to the end of this week's show. As always, thank you for tuning in, and please join us again next week, and every week, on the NLSC, nba-live.com, our YouTube channel, or wherever you listen to podcasts. In the meantime, make sure you're following us on social media. That's where you can get in touch with us, and of course, stay up to date with all of our content. So Derek, go ahead and plug the handles.
Yeah, you can reach me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at D43G and at D4384. I'm also on YouTube, D43, and on the NLSC, D43.
As for me, I'm Andrew in the forum, and Andrew NLSC on X and Blue Sky. The NLSC is on X, Facebook, and Blue Sky at the NLSC. We're also NLSC Basketball on Instagram and Threads. We're on YouTube at NBA Live Series Center. And of course, give a look to the NLSC itself, nba-live.com, for everything we do for basketball video games. So, thank you once again for tuning in, and until next time, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Derek.
Go get buckets, everyone.